going to begin tonight with our fifth session on the Church of God Mountain Assembly History and Doctrine. And I want to talk tonight about reinventing the Mountain Assembly. Where we left off from our last session had us laying some foundation for the Mountain Assembly. And so I want us tonight to begin to look at the way that the Church of God Mountain Assembly reinvented itself and made the transition, if you will, from the Baptist Association type organization that we were into the more denominational structure that we're familiar with today. And so that's what we're going to talk about here this evening. And we're going to start by just looking at the way in which we made that transition from association to organization. And specifically going to talk about turning the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God into the Church of God of the Mountain Assembly Incorporated. And so we'll talk about that name switch a little bit more in depth in just a moment. But let's first of all, when you think about what a denomination is or what an organization is, there's some characteristics that are more specific to an organization or a denomination than say a loose association of independent churches. And so I want to talk about some of those distinctives and just talk about the Mountain Assembly making that transformation and how you can see it in some of those characteristics. The first one that I want to look at is in the idea of holding common property. And again, we're talking about the shift from an association of locally governed independent churches who once a year meet and talk about common projects or common concerns that they might share, versus a group that is connected on a more regular basis. And just the idea of holding common property, that the organization, that the association owns property of its own. And this begins with the headquarters tabernacle. And we talked about it just a little bit last week, how that by 1922, the Assembly had established its permanent residence in Jellicoe, Tennessee. The tabernacle was erected there on Florence Avenue, and the Jellicoe Church became the headquarters church. And so the picture that I'm showing you is a picture of the original tabernacle. Remember I mentioned last week that there was a balcony that ran all the way around the top of it. You could actually go up and look over the pulpit area. In 1924, discussion turned toward erecting a mess hall to help feed those who attended. And there's so many people that were coming, and we talked about the way that the Jellicoe Church or the host church would be responsible for offering hospitality. They thought, wouldn't it be a lot easier for us to just feed the people while we got them here? And so they talked about erecting a mess hall. Actually estimated the cost of it. The cost of the tabernacle was a little over $4,000. I think it was like $4,129. I'd have to go back and look. You can look in your minute book and find out exactly. But they were talking about the fact that maybe for another $1,000 they could build a mess hall beside of it. And it was discussed for a couple of years before it was finally abandoned. The idea of it was abandoned just because the Assembly's indebtedness for the tabernacle had still not been paid. By 1928, the attendance was good. And the house was crowded at least on several occasions. There were as many people outside as there were inside. The tabernacle just wasn't large enough to hold the people, God bless you, for those 5 days and nights services. Along with this idea of owning common property, is the financing of the assembly. How are you going to pay for the assembly? How are you going to pay for the building? at the 1917 assembly, each church was asked to maintain a treasury. Now, it's hard for us to imagine a church not having a treasury today at all, but the advice was given to the church to maintain a treasury, and so we have to consider there had to be a reason that they were advised to. They just, many of them weren't didn't have a treasury of their own, but they were advised to begin maintaining a treasury. And that same year, Francis Marion Thomas was appointed to be the first general treasurer of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. Now, in 1917, the Assembly created this position, general treasurer, and 5 years later, the Assembly created a position of assembly treasurer. There are two different treasurers. It seems that one of them was responsible for receiving the tithe of tithes that were sent to headquarters and paying the expenses of the assembly as an organization versus somebody that handled the money that came in to pay the expenses of the General Assembly. And so there was a general treasurer and an assembly treasurer, two different treasurers, and the organization would operate with those two treasuries until 1944. Francis Thomas was the first general treasurer in 1917, and coincidentally, he was the first assembly treasurer in 1922 when that position was created. This financial planning included the development of a plan to pay for the tabernacle, the building. We got to pay off this building that collectively we're building together. And so ultimately, what they decided was assessing each church based on the number of members that the church had. And so the first tier was started out from 7 to 17 members and ended up, going up where if you had over 75 members. So that each church was asked to pay an assessment, if you will, a tax on the building of the tabernacle based on how many members that they had. So anywhere from $4 at the lower tier up to $26 at the upper tier to help pay for the building. The Assembly also adopted a tithe of tithe system in 1917. There was a ministers' meeting held at Pleasant View in December of 1917, where this was spelled out and was adopted at the 1918 Assembly. But the idea was that a tenth of a person's income should be paid into the local church, and then out of all of the tithes that are paid into the local church, that the church treasurer or deacon would take 10% of that and then send that to the general treasury, and that would help to pay for or to fund the expenses of the General Assembly. In 1928, they added to that a personal assessment. I mentioned just a few moments ago that each church would be asked to make a contribution that was based on the number of members they had to go toward the indebtedness, the outstanding indebtedness of the tabernacle. But in 1928, in order to help with the expense of the General Assembly, bringing people in and the expenses of the utility and the expenses of feeding the people and anything else that would be related to conducting the General Assembly, in 1928 they adopted a plan where that each member of the local church was asked to pay 50 cents to help to bear those assembly expenses. And then after that, they were asked to send $1 a year but for their assessments. those assessments would grow. They would change over the course of the years to where at one point it was $3 a year. I remember hearing stories about some treasurers or deacons that would go around to collect the assessments, and that would collect them on a monthly basis, 25 cents a month, for being a member of the church, so that at the end of the year, their assessment would be paid up and they could send that in. It finally topped out at $5 a year, and it was $5 a year for a long, long time. And that assessment would be sent in prior to the General Assembly to help with the expenses of the General Assembly until sometime in my lifetime. I forget how long ago this was. I'd have to look it up. But we eventually did away with the assessment, and now each church is asked to take up an offering the last Sunday night of June and send that offering to the to headquarters for the expense of the General Assembly.
This assessment, what necessarily did it do that they did away with?
The purpose of the assessment was that it helped offset the expense of the General Assembly. So that when the assembly was in Jellicoe, at the tabernacle in Jellicoe, the utility bills obviously would be higher in August. You had expenses of cleaning supplies and toilet paper and things like that. Well, the assembly for a long time operated a restaurant in the basement of the old tabernacle. So there was a lot of stuff up front that would have to be paid. They always tried to give a donation to the rescue squad for helping direct traffic in and out of the parking lot for the services. If they had to rent PA equipment or anything like that. The idea was it's expensive to hold a convention, or it would take money, and so they would ask each member of the local churches to pay $5 each year toward that expense. Now, obviously, they're taking up offerings at the assembly also, and those offerings, might bring in, well, depending on the size of the crowd, but at least two of the offerings would go to something specific. For example, youth night, mission night, those offerings would go toward those projects. It got to the place, and the reason they changed it and dropped the assessment, it just got to the place where so few pastors were asking their members to pay that money, or if you did ask, you didn't get much of a response from people. Their membership dues, if you will. The response was so little, so few churches were participating, that somebody submitted a resolution and said, let's just take up an offering, and whatever free will offering we get, we'll send it in. And so the bylaws specify a free will offering on the last Sunday night of June, and I don't think headquarters really cares when you take the offering up. If you get a better offering at another time, then basically, and now of course it's expensive to conduct the General Assembly in Pigeon Forge. There's not offerings that come in. The office is out, headquarters is out. Even with those offerings that come, even if every church sends in a good offering, you get 100 good offerings, you're still not going to pay for the expenses but every little bit helps. And so that was the purpose of it. And that the change in the system, the idea is still undergirds that, helps to undergird that cost. That answered your question?
Right.
Another thing about holding common property is the requirement for the assembly to have trustees, people to look after and to hold in trust the property that is deeded to the organization. And so in 1920, the first trustees were appointed. Francis Thomas, George Ford, and Jake Taylor were the first three who were appointed to receive the deed of any property that the assembly might hold in its trust, and to look after and to care for that property. In 1923, there was a question asked during the General Assembly about what should be done where outsiders come into our church houses, break the locks, take possession. And so it was recommended that each church, each local church, appoint 3 trustees to care for the local church property and to make sure that it was in repair, and that the assembly would also have 3 trustees to look after the properties that it holds the deeds for. And those trustees in 1923 that were appointed were Kurt Walker, Stephen Bryant, and John Parks. And, they were a committee that were appointed to appoint the committee. The trustees were Gilbert Weaver, John Shepherd, and J.T. Richardson. The idea was you really want, ideally, you would want trustees who were living close enough to the property where that if you needed to do something with the property, they could be there. If they needed to sign paperwork, then they were local, or if something needed to be done, a decision needed to be made, then you'd have them at your disposal. In 1925, there was a legal dispute that arose over a building in Harlan, Kentucky. And I don't know all of the details that are from the dispute. It ended up going to court. And the dispute was between the Church of God of the Mountain Assembly and the Church of God with headquarters in Cleveland, Tennessee. And because our name, our legal name when we were incorporated in 1917 was the Church of God, or the Churches of God, and the legal name of the other group was the Church of God, there was some confusion about and a dispute over the piece of property itself. Now, the Church of God Mountain Assembly, when it met at the General Assembly, said the local church needs to take care of that, and the Assembly's not going to get involved. But at the same time, we recognize there's the potential to have some conflict over property. And so in 1928, it was moved in order that the local churches, or the local trustees of each church, send their deeds to the assembly trustees, and move that the assembly trustees place them in a safety vault at First National Bank in Jellicoe for safekeeping. And so the recommendation was that each church would deed their property, that the local property would be conveyed, by a warranty deed to the trustees of the Church of God Mountain Assembly Incorporated, and that those deeds would be kept there at headquarters. And so, again, this idea of owning property is one of the things that is one of the evidences. You can see where the transition is taking place from an association of independent churches. We all have something common. There's something we all have a vested interest in these properties. Now, I mentioned the old tabernacle, the first tabernacle, and the fact that it was filled. Within 6 years, there were reports that there were as many people standing outside as there were inside. And so right away it became apparent that there was a need for something to be done. And by 1941, the tabernacle had been filled to capacity and overflowing for more than a decade. And finally there was some discussion about remodeling the tabernacle or building a new one there in Jellicoe. And so finally the decision was made to rebuild. And in 1942, the assembly opened up in the new tabernacle. And I've got a picture of it from in the mid-80s. This is the front view. I wish I had a better side view. This is the tabernacle that was in use from 1942 through 1965. And at that first assembly in 42, it was filled to capacity before the week was over. They had already filled it up. John Parks attended one of the services there, standing up as if to give his nod of approval to the new tabernacle. It would be his last assembly as as fate would have it, if you will. But holding common property is one of those things that helps us to see how we were making this transition. And let me talk about this idea of moving, the transition. We'll give you a few more of those examples. But just, again, seeing the transition from independent to dependent churches. And I told you, you remember last week in the first session when I talked about the Baptist mindset is that each church is autonomous. We're locally governed, congregationally governed, that this church is not dependent on any other church. We take care of all the business that needs to be taken care of. And so the mindset of that association of independent churches transforming itself into a group that really, in a lot of ways, is dependent on one another is what we're trying to show you the examples of. Now, I want to talk about the significance of the name. I mentioned last week when we talked about the transit as far as identity is concerned, how the name helps us to speak about who we are. It talks about identity. And, the name was changed. And we talked about some of the nuances of that. And I mentioned that there was a transition that took place in the minutes, where the minutes were, had made the change from the minutes of the churches of God, or the Mountain Assembly of the churches of God, to become the minutes of the Church of God of the Mountain Assembly. And so this transition took place in 1943, 1944. In 1943, it's the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God. And in 44, it's the Church of God, Mountain Assembly. Church of God Incorporated, Mountain Assembly in parentheses is what the minutes bear. So this changing mindset from plural, the plural churches, to the singular church. In American history, we talk about the United States of America. Before the Civil War, the United States of America is a plural. It's, when you talked about the United States, you talked about those United States. You'd say the United States are what have you. And after the Civil War became singular, the name of the country is singular, where you'd say the United States is. And so the same kind of mindset is taking place in the organization in the mid-40s, where instead of a group of independent churches, we start seeing ourselves and thinking of and using the terminology of a single church. We talk about membership between congregations. And still to this day, when a person joins the Church of God Mountain Assembly, they're joining that local church. I'll talk about the church covenant in a session of its own before we're done. We'll talk about what membership entails and talk about the strength of the covenant, what have you. But the covenant that we use is, the idea is when you join the church, you're joining that local congregation, Middlesboro, Kentucky, or Ferguson, Kentucky. You're joining that local congregation. It is connected in its association. It's connected and dependent on the other churches within our fellowship. And we start seeing that become more pronounced in the 1920s. Whereas before, your membership in one local church had nothing to do with what was going on in any of the other churches that might be in your neighborhood, in your particular geographic area, or even within your association. But 1921, it was moved in order by the assembly that each local church shall have the final decision as to excluding their members. So it's up to the church to bring in members. It's up to the church to dismiss members. And with that, it was also moved in order that by this assembly, that each member that has been excluded shall first be reconciled to the church that excluded them before becoming a member of another church of the same faith and order. So in other words, if you got into trouble or what have you, were dismissed in a local church within the Church God Mountain Assembly, before you could go join another church, you had to first be reconciled. Our churches began to think of themselves outside of the local congregation and started thinking about their responsibility to each other. That if somebody caused trouble at the church down the road and were dismissed, they were disciplined by that particular church, they were excluded from that fellowship, they couldn't just pack up the stuff, go to the church down the street and join that church and be in good standing in that church without having first made things right in the church where their offense was created. So you see, this is an entirely different mindset from totally autonomous churches, where yes, the church has the responsibility for receiving and dismissing its own members, but at the same time, you can't go down the road and join another church within our fellowship, within our association, our organization, that without first being reconciled to that church. We see the same concept in the case of offending pastors. There's a provision added in 1921 also, that it should a pastor be guilty of bad conduct or false doctrine, that the church had the responsibility of calling him to order. If your pastor has had a moral failure, your pastor's preaching a contrary doctrine, it was the church's responsibility to call him to order. Now, if no ordained minister was present, they were given the instruction to call upon 2 or 3 ordained ministers from the sister churches to assist them. You know, if you call the door and say, hey, you're preaching wrong, maybe the deacons or the church gets together, says what you're doing, your conduct is unbecoming of a minister, or what you preached Sunday was not in the Bible way. If he accepted that and repented, then the church could work together in harmony. Otherwise, you see the church start thinking outside of the local congregation, and that they were given the opportunity to call on ordained ministers from other churches, to call them together, 2 or 3 in a group, to serve as a counsel to help assist them and to in correcting an offense. Also in the 1920s, there was a provision given for churches that had less than 3 male members to call upon neighboring churches in order to assist them with a transaction of business. Now, why is that important? Because in the 1920s, we did not allow our women to speak in business meetings. We did our churches, coming out of the Baptist tradition, the men made the motions and made the second. The men transacted the business in the church. Women in the church might have been allowed to vote. They might have been allowed to participate in church business by voting, but they weren't allowed to speak and discuss and put forth motions. So if you had a church where there was a small church, didn't have a whole lot of members, then the provision was given to borrow members from a church that was nearby. A few men could come over and help to transact business that needed to be transacted. Now, I'm sharing that not to condone or to condemn the idea of women speaking in business. That's not the point. The point that I'm making is we see that churches are starting to depend on each other, rely on each other. So they're starting to think outside of the local church. We're that transition from independent to dependent churches, from association to a denomination. Another thing that took place during this same time period is we see the beginnings of a church calendar. The association had been meeting on an annual basis to get together for 1 week a meeting, might have a few church services, transact the business that needed to be transacted for the association, and then other than, maybe having a revival here and there where you might invite one of the brothers to come and preach, or you might have, if they're close enough, they can come over and attend a revival service with you. But there wasn't a whole lot that took place as far as the association was concerned, except for that annual meeting. But in 1915, the assembly began having ministers' meetings scheduled throughout the year. They started out scheduling 3 ministers' meetings every few months. They would meet together, and so that you would, on a quarterly basis, meet together in fellowship. And sometimes these meetings included the transaction of business that had the same significance or the same effective power as you would if you were meeting in the General Assembly. So the churches were encouraged, the ministers especially were encouraged to attend these ministers' meetings. Come quarterly and be together for fellowship and and to transact any particular business that might need to be transacted. But here's another one more thing that I want to point out on this particular slide, and that is the issuance of credentials. In 1911, the Assembly, on motion and second, that we give all the ordained ministers of the Assembly a certificate from the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God. So as early as 1911, we begin recognizing that we need some sort of a certificate from the Assembly that endorses a man's ministry. And I know the subject of credentials is probably well beyond the scope of just this one class session. That's an interesting topic, maybe for another time. But the idea is, in the local church, a local church can ordain a preacher. And they had, and that was in the Baptist mindset. Baptist church, the local church, always has the authority to ordain ministers and deacons. That's in their mindset. And they can print a certificate from that local church signifying that this person has been ordained. But in the 1910s, we start seeing in the first 5 years of the association's existence, we start seeing them think outside the local church. We're going to issue credentials, not that they're credentialed just from Saxton or from Little Wolf Creek, but a little broader appeal. Nowadays you can get credentials on the internet. I mean, just any one of us in the room can probably have a license within the hour, for that matter. But the legitimacy of those credentials, are going to be on what's behind them, who it is that's issuing them. In 1925, a motion was made that we actually print or have struck some ordination papers, and the number that was suggested, we're going to print 500. Doesn't that sound ambitious? We're going to print 500 certificates for ordination. In 1927, we moved that we ordain no man to the ministry that doesn't belong to the church and don't believe or stand for the doctrine of the church. And so again, there's a connection to the local church and a connection to the association itself. 1936, the Assembly ordered a seal to seal those credentials with, and all credentials not bearing the standard seal of the Church of God Mountain Assembly were null and void. Let's talk about the emergence of a denominational polity. Another way that we see the transformation from association to organization is in the emergence of a denominational polity. In the early days, they would get together in the association and they would transact business. They might have several resolutions that they all had in common. But those resolutions, when the assembly was over, or what have you, there was no effective And so in 1915, the assembly that year created the first standard resolutions. They went back through the previous minute books to determine which resolutions to retain. And so they looked through the minute books of 1907, 11, 12, 13, and 14 and pulled out the resolutions that would be best for the churches. The idea is that these are going to be the standard resolutions that we continue to hold to that exist or that last beyond that one time. It wasn't just a one-time act. So we start seeing the emergence of something that resembles modern bylaws, a constitutional declaration, a form of government. And so when we talk about a denominational polity, that's what we're talking about, is a government. We see the first standing, the first standard resolutions. And along with that, 1917, a covenant and articles of faith. We talked about that last week. And by 1925, the minute book each year carried forward all of the valid resolutions. And so you can start seeing printed on an annual basis all of those standard resolutions. Pick up any minute book and the bylaws or the governing principles or policies of the Church God Mountain Assembly are printed in there on an annual basis. Another thing that signifies that transition, and we see it in this idea of a denominational sense, a denominational government, is the idea of standing officers. Now, initially, in the Baptist Association, the moderator was elected at the beginning of that session, and he served as the moderator for the session. The clerk recorded the minutes for that session. Now, there might be at the beginning of the next year, the last year's moderator might be the one that opens up the session and conducts the election or receives the motion, what have you, to appoint a new moderator. And the clerk might be the one recording, and then they change places or what have you. But the idea was that all of the officers that were appointed, all the committees that were appointed, they transacted their business for that week. You know, the resolution committee, for example, is the oldest committee that we have. And, you know, it's the oldest committee. We had a resolution committee at the first assembly. The resolution committee's job during the week of the assembly was to consider and to bring forth, to write, to draft resolutions and to present them to the assembly that week for their consideration. And their job, when the assembly was over, their job was over. You know, they were done. The week's over, and so our job is over. And same thing with the Committee on Divine Services. When the assembly was over, there weren't any more preachers to call on to preach, and so the work was done. And so in the association model, there are no standing officers. In a denominational model, there are. And in 1912, the assembly elected its first standing committee. 1912, it was a committee on Sunday schools. Kurt Walker, Pete Huddleston, Francis Thomas, William Hicks, and J.F. Norman were the first Sunday school committee. Their job was to stimulate interest and to promote Sunday school work. Now, a lot of our churches at that time didn't have Sunday schools. And so the work of the Sunday school was, the Sunday school committee was important work, teaching others on the importance of it, developing Sunday schools, how to prepare a Sunday school, and organize a Sunday school. And we decided this is something you can't do just during the week of the assembly. We're going to have a Sunday school committee. Their job is going to exist beyond just this week. They're going to have to go to churches and help these churches. And so the first standing committee was a committee on Sunday schools. In 1915, the assembly appointed its first evangelist. And you see, an evangelist obviously is going to do more than just during the week of the assembly. You know, he's going to get out and conduct revivals. And in 1915, Henry Mobley was the first evangelist appointed by the Church of God Mountain Assembly to serve as an evangelist, to go and to preach into our communities and into our churches. The following year, he was reappointed, and in 1960, we actually discussed the possibility of the assembly purchasing a tent so they could conduct tent revivals in the places where he went. In 1922, there was a committee that was put together to work out a solution whereby the letters that come to the assembly could be gathered together. Now, again, in the early days of the General Assembly, the first 15 years, when you came to the assembly, you brought your letter with you. The church brought its letter, listing their messengers, listing their pastor and their clerk, their deacons, their ordained ministers, their membership. They brought those letters with them. Someone would read those letters publicly, and that lettering in, you joined the association. In 1922, they said, you know what? This job of reading these letters, putting these letters together, would be so much easier if we actually came to the assembly and had them already put together. We might even be able to print them ahead of time, and so that it would facilitate this business. And so they asked each church to send their letter. So again, you can see the clerk's job doesn't end when the assembly is over, and even when he prints the minute book. But he's going to be counted on the following year, but in the month or so prior to the General Assembly, of receiving those letters and putting them together to present them in a matter of business. 1924 and again in 1925, the assembly chose as its evangelist the moderator Stephen Bryant. And so we see that the moderator is going to do something more than just conduct the business during the week of the assembly. They actually wanted him to travel and be in the churches and preach in the churches and evangelize. You know, a little precursor to what we're going to see later on with a full-time general overseer. In 1933, the assembly voted that the moderators of the assembly, the moderator and the assistant moderator, serve as our evangelists, and that the tithe of tithes will furnish them with their traveling expenses. They wanted each church to be visited, and the church would take them up an offering, or if they were able to help them defray with their expenses. But the assembly was going to undergird some of the expense that was associated with, again, this model is not at all like the model of the Baptist Association. The moderator is becoming someone who during the course of the year is having some influence and is providing some leadership to the organization. Actually made a motion that the moderators do not pastor churches that year, but spend their time visiting the local churches. That I might mention. In 1934, Stephen Bryant had been the moderator for that previous year, and the question was asked on how we're going to vote on officers. Up until that time, typically the vote would be something like this: I make a motion that Stephen Bryant serve as our moderator, and that John Park serve as our assistant moderator. And then likewise, I make a motion that J.C. Taylor be our clerk. And so one person made a motion, and then typically you would vote on that motion, and whoever was put forth in a motion, they may be the one to serve. And so by 1930, we're talking about a little change in government, a change in polity. They decided that year that instead, that the voting on the election of officers would be limited to ordained ministers along with ordained deacons, that they would vote and that they would openly nominate the moderator, the assistant moderator, the clerk, and the assistant clerk, and then the vote would be taken up secretly. And so for the first time, 1934, when open nominations, where multiple people are nominated, secret ballot vote, and the majority vote getter was the one that was elected. And that first year, coincidentally, John Parks was elected moderator. It's the only year that he ever served as moderator. Stephen Bryant declined. He cited health reasons, said that his health was poor, and he just didn't have the stamina to travel like they wanted him to travel at the time. Let's talk about also a limited delegation. 1924, question was asked, how many messengers from each church, how many messengers should be allowed from each church? And so the assembly requested that each church limit their delegates to 3. You know, prior to this, any number, and it wasn't a hard and fast rule set in stone. It was a request, so that one church didn't dominate, you know, the discussion or dominate the business or what have you, but to limit their request to 3. In 1929, the order was made restricting each church to only 3 lay members, along with their ordained ministers. So you were allowed, 1929 it became a law, you're only allowed 3 delegates. We'll talk about how that changed a little bit. Let me talk about the elder board. In 1919, the assembly appointed 12 brethren: John Parks, Stephen Bryant, Newt Parks, Kurt Walker, Kim Moses, Levi White, Joshua Baird, George Ford, James Goins, and Henry Mobley, Sterling Smith, and John Thomas, to the office of elder, and their purpose was to plan together with each church as far as our work will extend. And their work shall consist in keeping the churches in progress. They shall have the right to call meetings with any church for any cause, to investigate the conduct of pastors or churches in case of a question that may arise. Should either of these 12 brethren depart from the faith, then the remainder are able to add to their number so that the work can go on. And so you see that the idea was, we're going to turn this, in some cases, the control of local churches, what before would have been the choice of local churches in dealing with grievances or discipline issues or what have you. Instead of local church handling that, the elders have the right to come in and make decisions and steer that church in the right direction according to their wisdom and discretion. Now, I mentioned just a moment ago that about the transition in an offending pastor. As a response to what I just described, the elder's role was, the churches said, you know what, the churches need more authority, it still ought to be the church's discretion, and if they need help, they can call on neighboring ordained ministers to come. And so this plan that started in 1919 was changed in 1920. Said, you know what, maybe there were some issues in local churches where it didn't work out and what have you, but they changed that. But in 1921, there was a move to drop the elders, to release the 12 elders, and I'm sorry, it wasn't the following year, it was 2 years later, and that each church, you know, should have a meeting each month and transact their business, and you know, just like in the case of offenses or what have you that I described, then they can call on somebody else to come to their aid. And I'm sorry if I'm being confusing tonight because I'm trying to watch the clock. In 1922, following year, at a ministers' meeting in April in Williamsburg, there were several men that were asked to write on the work of an elder. They were given the task to write what is the purpose, what is the work, what is the job of an elder. And John Parks, Stephen Bryant, Henry Mobley, George Ford, and Sterling Smith were the 5 that wrote their article, their opinion, on their essay on what the job of an elder was. They brought those manuscripts, they brought those reports to the General Assembly, and they were read at the Assembly that year, and there was a question asked on whether we should have elders or not. And so the committee that year that they put together reported that it was in the best interest of the assembly to have a board of elders to fulfill the role that was described by the men that read their report. So the vote was taken on the committee's report, their endorsement of the idea, and 57 were in favor and 14 were against having a board of elders. And so the question was asked, who all is qualified to be an elder? How many feel like you're qualified to be an elder? And everybody that felt like they were qualified to be an elder stood up. And there were 13 men that stood up attesting that they were qualified. And so Henry Mobley and S.N. Bryant were selected as a committee to choose the elders. And they chose 6 of those 13 men to be an elder board. The following year, there was a move in order that we appoint 12 elders as servants of the assembly or churches in case of necessity or questions, and their duties should be to look after the interests of the said mountain assembly, and the said elders shall be subject to the orders of the said assembly. And so we go back to a board of, and so there are 12 guys, 12 brothers, 12 men who were appointed that year to the elder board. 1924. The 12 elders who were selected in 1923, their duty that was outlined into looking after neglected churches, to make sure churches have pastors, to inquire about ministers who hold credentials but are not pastoring, why they're not doing something. Euless would appreciate that. Why have you got credentials if you're not out there pastoring? And then each elder was required to report separately to the assembly on their work. In 1926, there was a motion that the 12 elders hold quarterly meetings throughout the year so that they can conduct and transact business that might arise. In 1930, I want you to see that we talk about the elder board was created in 1919. But the elder board that was created in 1919 is not the same thing as the elder board was in 1921, not the same thing it was in 1923, not the same thing it was in 1926. That the role and the job of the elder was constantly changing through those years. And even sometimes it was a temporary, we voted this year to have elders, and next year we voted, we don't have elders anymore. We took their authority away. In 1930, and since 1930, every year since 1930, we've had an elder board. And that year, John Parks and S.N. Bryant and Kurt Walker were appointed to the board of elders. The 3 of them were made elders, and they were given the power to select 9 other qualified elders to make out the full number of 12. And so the assembly appointed 3 and then said, you guys pick the other 9. And so they chose C.L. Price, J.B. Spears, Emmy Woolham, A.J. Long, Thomas Woods, William Sharp, Drew Stanifer, John Bryant, and Lewis Baird. And so they became the board of elders. And that has been a position that has not had a limitation. It did not have a limitation of office as long as they were in good standing. Now they could be removed for bad conduct or poor health, or as sometimes they would be. But the idea was it was almost like a Supreme Court justice. You were there, you were appointed for life. And so we see the beginnings of a denominational form of government with the emergence of these offices, something a little more regular. But I want to just say this because it relates. The creation of a denominational periodical, having a monthly letter, a monthly newsletter, was one more thing that helped to bring the association together into, we're more than just a group of independent local churches. Now granted, any independent church can get a subscription to any magazine that they choose to. Church members can subscribe to the Reader's Digest. But that don't mean everybody that subscribes to the Reader's Digest is part of a club, or everybody everybody that subscribes to it. But the idea of a denominational magazine, a denominational newsletter, signifies more than just, we're all part of something. We're reading about what's going on. We're keeping in touch. What a church calendar can't do. You know, even if you meet 4 times a year, what you can't do in those quarterly meetings, getting a monthly magazine, a monthly newsletter, a monthly paper that's reporting on you're reading sermons, you're hearing church news, you're seeing testimonies. That does a lot to bring the organization together in a way that a lot of other things could not do. And so I'll try to highlight that a little more when I come to that. But I want to talk about a new system of government. And really, this is I'm going to spend the last 15 minutes of this session talking about the new system of government, because more than anything else, when the Assembly's form of government changed, that's when the transition from association to organization, that's when we became a denomination. You know, we were an association, a loose association of independent churches, in 1907. And that transition, you know, and maybe there are some times you can say, well, this helped. I can see the beginnings of this, but the new system of government was a denominational form of government. So I want to talk about that. Just a little background, and mention the influence of the Church of God cannot be understated. The Church of God's influence can be seen in the financial system, the tithe system that we developed in 1917, 1918. There was a ministers' meeting in 1917 in December. Is basically a copy of the Church of God's tithe system that they instituted in January at their General Assembly that year. And the same thing is true about the elder board, and maybe the challenge behind our board of elders was we were trying to copy a model from the Church of God that just didn't work within our particular ecclesiology. But the idea of having a board of elders, again, is something that we borrowed from our friends down in Cleveland. Another thing that again, the influence of the Church of God is seen in just in the unity of the organization. The ecclesiology of the Church of God in Cleveland is such that there is one church, and it always has been. There's one church, and you might have multiple congregations, but you're all part of that one church. And at the top of that was A.J. Tomlinson, the Pope, if you will, of the Church of God. The general overseer has a general oversight of all the churches. And so, but if you joined the Church of God, you became a member of the Church of God. And you were standing in the General Assembly. And that was true no matter which congregation you might be at this particular Sunday. We're all part of the Church of God. And so we begin to see that influence, that mindset. And the more we associate with the Church of God, the more that mindset is beginning to develop in some of our men. Now the question is asked, well, Brother Padgett, we talked about the attempt at merging that didn't happen. Why didn't we merge? Well, we never formally as an organization merged, but many of our men have been going that direction since very early on. Jonah Shelton was one of the first to make the transition. He was in that meeting in 1912 in Cleveland. Was one of the messengers that attended representing the Mountain Assembly, and he ended up becoming a part of the Church of God shortly thereafter. But in 1922, G.A. Fore was elected to serve as moderator for the Assembly. J.L. Goins was his assistant. Starling Smith was the clerk, and Francis Thomas was the assistant clerk. Now, Francis Thomas was also the Assembly treasurer. I mentioned that earlier in the session. The four of them were elected to what is now our executive board, the executive officers. These 4 men were elected to the Church of God, and shortly after the assembly, G.A. Ford and Starling Smith and F.M. Thomas left the Mountain Assembly and joined the Church of God in Cleveland. So 3 of the 4 officers who were elected in 1922 joined the Church of God. And of course, in the preface of the minute book, they're still listed as having served in those offices at the General Assembly. But John Parks has an editorial note where he talks about the fact that they had left, and it was their choice, and that they were gone, and that they left the assembly in a pretty rough shape. Now, J.L. Goins was the only member of that executive board that did not leave the assembly that year. But 3 years later, he asked for a letter of recommendation from the Mountain Assembly at the General Assembly, and they granted him one, and he joined the Church of God. And so all 4 of them, within 3 years, would become members of the Church of God. Now, Goins, by the way, perhaps more than anybody else who ever made that transition, made a larger impact in the Church of God than anybody else up to that time. He had served as a state overseer, and it seemed like he maybe been on and served in an executive capacity. I'll look that up and try to let you know more about that. But for a long time, I think he died in 1971. It served in various departments, doing mission work. An important part. So you think about where the assembly might have been had some of these bright, promising young men not made that transition, but there they were. Let's talk about again. We're talking about this new system of government. Talk about the passing of a generation. 5 years after the first assembly, at the age of 39, George Daniel Cadell died. He's the first delegate from the first assembly to have passed away. Just a couple of years later, Thomas Higginbotham, who had been the oldest delegate at the first assembly, died at the age of 70. In the first 15 years, by the 15th annual assembly, by the 10th General Assembly, at least 15 of the first 51 delegates had passed away, including Alan Moses, who you remember played such a pivotal role in the committees and the organizational planning of the Assembly. Let me talk about a few other individuals. Thomas DeBerry Moses, born September the 3rd, 1856, and died June 10th, 1928, was saved about 1893, was baptized by John Parks, ordained to preach the gospel of Jesus in 1898. He died in 1928. Newton K. Parks, the brother of John, born October the 13th, 1858, died November the 10th, 1936. He pastored 2 of the churches during that first assembly. He'd served as assistant moderator for 4 years. He was also one of the 12 elders the first 2 times that elders were appointed, and died in 36. Stephen Nathan Bryant was born July the 30th, 1887. He was elected moderator in 1908, continued to serve until 1922, and then again in 1923, from 1923 to 1934, and then for a third time from 35 to 39. A total of 29 years that he served as moderator. 6 different men served as his assistant. And so he's one that his leadership was looked to, his ability to conduct a meeting, his preaching ability, his personality. He was a member of the Board of Elders for more than 20 years. He pastored multiple churches and was obviously an important part, one of our founders, if you will. And then John Hansford Parks, born July 5th, 1861, called into the ministry while a young man in his 20s. In his nearly 60 years in the ministry, baptized nearly 600 people. He served as moderator 1 year. He was the assistant moderator 6. Was on the board of 12 elders 24 years. Pastored at least 6 churches. and preached over 20 times at the General Assembly, including the first sermon at the First Assembly. And he died in August 2nd, 1943. As this generation is passing away, and a new generation is going to take its place, then you can see that the change is going to be inevitable. The transition that's taking place it can't be. The change is coming, whether you want to or not. Let me talk about the new generation. I'm going to talk about 5 people, 5 men. Just mention them that are very important as part of this second generation. First one is John Harrison Bryant. Now, it's almost silly for me to call John Harrison Bryant part of the second generation because he was a delegate at the First Assembly. He was the youngest delegate at the First Assembly, along with his father and his grandfather. He was ordained in 1925. He pastored 6 churches, including the Whitley City Church, for more than 40 years. At the death of his father, in 1939, he was elected that year as the assistant moderator. And he was a member of the elder board for 35 years. John Harrison Bryant. Andrew Johnson Long, born August the 21st, 1892. To John Long and Sarah Lay. John Long was a delegate at the First Assembly. James Lay from the same church at Zion Hill is probably a cousin of his mother. And so he has a connection by blood to that First Assembly. But also, he married Desi Silcox sometime around 1914, the daughter of Andrew Silcox, the first moderator. So his father-in-law was the first moderator, and his father had been a delegate at the First Assembly. Long began pastoring in the 1920s. 1928, he served as assistant clerk. In 1934, he was elected to serve as assistant moderator under S.N. Bryant. When Bryant died in 1939, A.J. Long was elected moderator. He guided the assembly during the construction of the new tabernacle. And he served as an elder for 17 years. It would have been longer, but we'll get to that. John Edward Hatfield, born April the 30th, 1904 in Woolridge, Tennessee. 1923, graduated as valedictorian from Junco High School. Completed business training at a business school in Knoxville. 1930, he was saved, sanctified, baptized with the Holy Ghost, and baptized in water by John Parks. He joined the Church of God Mountain Assembly that same year, felt the call of God in the ministry, and was ordained in November 1931 by J.H. Parks and Louis Baird. 7 years later, he was elected to the Board of Elders and served in that capacity for 38 years. He was the founding editor of the Gospel Herald in 1942 and was its editor for 25 years. He also served 3 years as assistant clerk, served as general secretary and treasurer under 7 general overseers. Pastored a number of our churches. John Hatfield died in 1981. Luther Gibson, born in Chenoa, Kentucky, January the 18th, 1914. His ministry of 52 years affected the lives of so many people. Joined the Church of God Mountain Assembly at Fondee on August the 30th, 1930. Ordained January the 4th, 1936 by Dave Hammett and Jimmy Longsworth. He pastored many churches. Henderson Grove, Stanfield, Kenford, Kentucky, Jellicoe, Tennessee, Dayton and Sidney, Ohio, and Trenton, Michigan. He was instrumental in organizing the churches in Troy, Piqua, Greenville, and Salina, Ohio. In addition to pastoral work, he served the organization as general overseer for 3 years, assistant overseer for 10, mission board chairman for 3. He was an elder for 33 years, preached at 24 assemblies, and was the author of the assembly's first history book and edited also the second edition. Andrew Clayton Lawson, born July 14th, 1910 in Knoxville, Tennessee. He was saved in Cincinnati under the ministry of H.D. Williams, ordained in 1936, pastored in Sydney and Cincinnati and Ohio and Covington, Kentucky. He's the only man to have served in all 4 executive offices of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. He served as General Overseer for 14 years, Assistant Overseer for 3, General Secretary and Treasurer for 2, Assistant Clerk for 2, was a National Evangelist for 2 years, and was an Elder for 43 years. He's one of 4 men to have preached in all 3 of the tabernacles in Jellicoe, and he preached at least 29 times during the General Assembly. Take just a good look at these 5 men, this new generation, these 5 men. These 5 men are among the most important men in the history of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. You've got to know something about them if you hope to do well on the final exam. These 5 men, certainly, if you took the top 10 most important people in the Church of God Mountain Assembly, these 5 are among those 5. I point them out because of their importance, and also because these 5 men were appointed at an elders meeting on September the 5th, 1944, right before the General Assembly. They were appointed a committee to plan a new system of government for the Assembly. And so the following day, the committee presented their proposal to the delegation at the opening of the General Assembly, and this new plan would change just about everything. The first major change dealt with who would make the major decisions. The proposal called for a bishops' council that would meet on Tuesday before the General Assembly began on Wednesday. The bishops' council was ordained ministers. And the ordained ministers would be the ones who would be the lawmaking body of the assembly. They would elect the officers. They would elect all the officers of the General Assembly. And so the elders and the ordained ministers would become the bishops' council. Also, there were some changes made to the executive offices. Instead of a moderator, the assembly would have a general overseer. And the general overseer's duty would be to look after the general interest of all the churches, keep a record of all the ministers, and moderate the General Assembly. He'd be allowed to pastor one church, but his travel expenses would be paid by the assembly. The committee also proposed to change the office of clerk. The clerk's duties were combined with the duties of the assembly treasurer and the general assembly, or the general treasurer, to create the office of general secretary and treasurer. And so the general secretary and treasurer became the clerk and the treasurer of the assembly, and assumed both treasuries. The assembly created a finance committee that would audit the treasurer's books and authorize expenditures, and devise a means for increasing the assembly's income. Along with the general overseers, each state would have an overseer. And the state overseers were to look after the interests of their churches in their state, keep a record of the ministers, report monthly to the general overseer, and the state overseer would be required to report to the assembly and basically detail the work within their state and work within their bounds. Another change, the Board of 12 Elders was retained, but its nature changed. And the Board of Elders would become the judicial body of the assembly. They would have the final decision on any dispute that was brought to them. There are also some changes that were made to the assembly's polity. The standard resolutions were amended. There was a new and revised order of business presented. There were 34 separate changes that were proposed in the standard resolutions. Among those 34 different changes, 25 resolutions were totally omitted. 7 were revised, and 2 were moved to the teachings of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. And so on September the 7th, 1944, the delegation voted to receive the report of the committee with all the changes, additions, and deletions as presented. In just 48 hours, a brand new organization was born. A.J. Long was the general overseer. Serving him as the assistant overseer was Clayton Lawson. J.E. Hatfield was the general secretary and treasurer. And I know what some of you are saying, those 3 of the guys that were on the committee. They were creating jobs for themselves. Truth of the matter was, they were probably going to be Hatfield had already been the clerk, and Long had already been the general overseer. Truth of the matter was, these men were going to serve whether they were serving in positions that they were created or not. Ira Moses was elected as the Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer, and the new state overseers. Kim Moses was the state overseer of Kentucky, Luther Gibson, Tennessee, Roy Cornelius in Ohio, Morris Woolham in Michigan, and Thomas Woods in Indiana. And so these new officers, the creation of a new organization was about to, here in the mid-1940s, was about to launch us into the rest of the century, and we'll talk about what happened when we come back. But